last judge said, 2015 marks the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the Vietnam War. Other than the 4 days of draft riots during the Civil War, no conflict in American history caused such social upheaval as did the war in Vietnam. And in no war before or since have the American people actually blamed the common soldier for doing his or her duty. What happened that caused the American people to turn against not only their government, but also their military? Vietnam is a good example of how the same event can be viewed from totally different perspectives. For some, particularly those who served in the military, it is an example of how the U.S. military has always carried out the policies and orders of its civilian leaders. For others, the Americans who died were simply a bunch of suckers who should have rebelled or mutinied rather than fight in an unnecessary war for an unjust cause. One of the major problems with history textbooks is that history keeps happening. In mathematics, the Pythagorean theorem is the same today as it was 2,500 years ago. But with history texts, the farther in time we get away from an event, the less space that event is given. Because of space limitations, standard textbooks simply do not provide sufficient information for students to be completely informed about any particular subject. Additionally, there's the problem of bias. All authors write from their own particular perspective. Textbook authors and editors are no different. They can and do use words and phrases that can lead students to a particular way of thinking about a particular event. Of equal importance is not what they say and how they say it, but what they may choose to leave out. Although they are constantly being revised, textbooks do not reflect current scholarship. New research is uncovering previously unknown information all the time. Although there is a vast array of primary and secondary source material available, textbooks are not based on that material. They are based on each other, and they are not peer-reviewed. And because the information is truncated, students can come away with a completely incorrect understanding of what happened and why. A case in point is this explanation of Vietnam from one textbook used here in Texas. And I'll give you a moment to read it. Everybody got through it? Okay. Well, reading this, a student is given the impression that there was universal agreement with the Geneva Accords and with holding elections in 1956, and that no den diem was the villain. In fact, neither the United States nor South Vietnam signed that accord. U.S. officials felt that the Geneva Agreements, if allowed to be put into action, were a disaster. They were convinced that the national elections in Vietnam would result in an overwhelming victory for Ho Chi Minh, the man who had just defeated the French colonialists. Well, that only stands to reason. The South had no army in 1956. They had no way of ensuring that any elections would actually be free. Ho Chi Minh was an avowed communist. He had the army he had just used to defeat the French. There was no doubt in the minds of either the leaders in the South or the United States government that Ho would use that army to ensure the communists won any election. So the U.S. government scrambled to develop a policy that would, at the very least, save southern Vietnam from the communists. Within a year, the United States had helped establish a new anti-communist government in South Vietnam. That is how No Dinh Diem became president. The author goes on to say, or goes on to give limited information about Ho Chi Minh. Now, this is true enough. That's exactly what happened, the underlying portion. Then the author tells about Diem in the South. But nothing is said about the repression of dissent in the North and the fact that Ho Chi Minh also brutally put down all opposition to his government. Again, the student comes away from reading this paragraph with the impression that no Dien Diem was the villain, and that if the United States had just been more cooperative with Ho Chi Minh, the war would never have happened. In discussing America's involvement, the text says this. Again, true enough. What the author leaves out is the fear of the spread of communism that was shared by many other countries in the world at that time. At the end of World War II, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union had vowed to spread communism worldwide. This led to the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in September 1954. The signatories of the treaty are shown here. They were pledged to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. So the United States was certainly not alone in sending troops to fight in Vietnam. In fact, although not a signatory to the treaty, even South Korea sent over 300,000 men to fight in Vietnam. But in order to fully understand the war, we must go backwards. Because the United States would be accused of capitalist imperialism by intervening in Vietnam, it's necessary to briefly discuss the history of that area. As the European powers expanded their colonial possessions in the 19th century, France took control of what would be called French Indochina. The area would be captured and controlled by the Japanese in World War II. During the Japanese occupation, one of the strongest leaders in Indochina was Ho Chi Minh, who had been educated in France and the Soviet Union, and as I said before, wasn't about communism. However, as Churchill had said of Stalin during World War II, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Ho worked very closely with the OSS during World War II and was highly regarded by the United States. He saw the United States at that time as an anti-colonial power that would help his people gain their independence from France after the war ended. After the Japanese were defeated, speaking from the northern city of Hanoi on September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent of French rule. At the ceremony declaring this independence, Ho began by quoting Thomas Jefferson. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Ho said he looked forward to intimate and friendly relations with the United States. He offered the U.S. naval bases and promised that Vietnam will be a fertile field for American capital and enterprise. The French, in the person of General Charles de Gaulle, became the stumbling block. They wanted their colonies back. In World War II, de Gaulle had been a leader of the Free French, the resistance to the Nazis, and he was dedicated to restoring the power and glory of France. But the French Communist Party was extremely strong. In fact, the Communists had done much more for the resistance during the war than had de Gaulle. President Harry Truman was politically vulnerable to charges of being soft on communism, and there was increasing concern about Ho's communist affiliations. The U.S. feared a communist takeover in France, and de Gaulle argued that the only way to stave off such a political takeover was to restore the old French Empire. Now, it must be remembered that while all this was going on, Mao Zedong had brought China under communist control in 1949. And in June 1950, the communists in North Korea invaded South Korea, starting the Korean War, which lasted until 1953. It's now known that the North Koreans had the explicit support of the Soviet Union and Red China when they conducted that invasion in August of 1950. The Soviet Union supplied men and materiel. And in November 1950, China entered the conflict, sending over 200,000 men across the Yalu River, attacking American forces. Well, the Korean War ended in a ceasefire in July 1953, with the country left divided at the 38th parallel. It remains divided to this day, and American troops are still there protecting the South from the Communist North. Now to get back to our story about Vietnam. Gradually, Ho was abandoned for fear of communist influence in Asia and communist takeover in France. Despite Ho's stated preference for the United States as an ally, the position of the United States government became one of you could not be a communist and be an ally of the United States. If you were a communist, you must be a satellite of China or the Soviet Union. So the fear of Soviet expansion led to the Truman policy of containment, which again was based on the Soviet Union's stated intention to spread communism worldwide. With a vast army and nuclear capability, the Soviets were seen as a formidable potential enemy. This map shows the spread of communism by 1950. The largest country in the world, Russia, and the most populated country in the world, China, were now under communist control. Stalin's plans seemed to be coming true in Asia. This led to the U.S. backing the French Army's return to Vietnam in 1951. The French then launched a war against Ho Chi Minh's army, the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh ultimately defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And this brings us back to those Geneva Accords of 1954 and the Domino Theory. President Eisenhower began U.S. support for South Vietnam throughout the 50s, sending military advisors to help train the South's army. When President Kennedy took office, he decided to step up U.S. military assistance to the South Vietnamese government. And by 1964, there were more than 16,000 U.S. advisors in Vietnam. Now, most Americans at this time didn't even know where Vietnam was, let alone have fears of a communist takeover there. But this was still a time in America when the public trusted their government. That began to change with the television images of what was actually happening. For the first time in history, Americans could see images from a war zone on their TV each night. Images of South Vietnamese soldiers firing on Buddhists. Buddhist monks immolating themselves in protest to Diem's government. And this scene of South Vietnam's chief of intelligence executing a Viet Cong prisoner led to evening news. These scenes caused Americans to begin to question exactly what sort of regime our government was supporting. Ultimately, even Kennedy could not continue to support Diem's regime, and he tacitly approved a military coup. Diem was assassinated in November 1963. The country was then taken over by a military junta led by General Nguyen Van Thieu. Thieu was then elected president of South Vietnam in an election in 1965. 1965 would mark the beginning, the official start of the Vietnam War when President Johnson deployed the first U.S. combat troops. On February 9th, a U.S. Marine Hawk anti-defense battery, or air defense battery, was deployed outside Da Nang to protect the vital U.S. air base there. On February 22nd, General William Westmoreland requested 2 battalions of Marines to protect the Dong Ha Air Base, or the Da Nang Air Base, from 6,000 Viet Cong who were massing in the vicinity to attack. On March 2nd, the U.S. began Operation Rolling Thunder, bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply line from the north into South Vietnam. This operation was scheduled to last 8 weeks. Instead, it went on for 3 years. On March 8th, 3,500 Marines landed at China Beach. On May 3rd, 3,500 men of the 173rd Airborne Brigade became the first U.S. Army combat troops deployed to Vietnam. Back home in October, 25,000 people marched in Washington in support of the war. The march was led by 5 Medal of Honor recipients. Now, while American support for the war was not overwhelming in terms of public opinion, from 1965 through 1968, the American people were in general support of the war. By 1968, this had all changed. Now, while it is a somewhat humorous truism that is often used facetiously, it is a truism nonetheless that generals tend to always fight the last war. The military is a very conservative bureaucracy and is very slow to change. In terms of military structure and tactics, the United States was out of its element in Vietnam. The U.S. Army was structured to fight as it had fought in World Wars I and II in Korea, and to fight the Soviet Union on the plains of Europe. Heavy conventional forces trained and equipped to fight a war of attrition. While the North Vietnamese Army did have conventional forces, they and their Viet Cong fighters in the South fought a guerrilla war. They used tactics such as the ambush and booby traps. American generals were ill-equipped by both training and experience to fight such a war. Like the battleship admirals who fought tooth and nail against the aircraft carrier in the 1930s, in the 60s, the U.S. Army considered Special Operations Forces as an insignificant branch of limited utility. Consequently, generals like William Westmoreland, Creighton Abrams, and Curtis LeMay, who had fought in World War II and Korea, were unwilling to adapt to the tactics of the enemy. As an example, Curtis LeMay had been a proponent of strategic bombing since World War II. He completely disdained tactical aircraft. Of the North Vietnamese, he said, quote, "They've got to draw in their horns and stop their aggression, or we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. And we'll shove them back into the Stone Age with air power or naval power, not with ground force." In one sense, LeMay was right. Strategic bombing did ultimately bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table to end the war in 1973, but by then, it didn't make any difference. In any event, these were the men advising the president and making the decisions on the battlefield. Such thinking led to the strategy of search and destroy. That strategy led to such incidents as the My Lai massacre, and it led to the destruction of the town of Bien Tre in February 1968, and the famous statement attributed to the S3 of the 3 of the 39th Infantry: "We had to destroy Bien Tre in order to save it." You see, prolonged exposure to the stress of combat does something to the individual. In some cases, an individual gradually forgets the very ideals for which he is fighting. A study of U.S. Army combatants on the beaches of Normandy in World War II found that after 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of the surviving soldiers had become psychiatric casualties. The remaining 2% were identified as aggressive psychopathic personalities. Thus, it's not too far off the mark to observe that there is something about continuous, inescapable combat which will drive 98% of all men toward insanity. And the other 2% were crazy when they got it. By contrast, there were Marine generals like Lew Walt and Victor Krulak. They had also fought in World War II in Korea. But because of its different mission, the Marine Corps had also fought in a series of guerrilla wars in Latin America in the 1930s. There was an institutional memory of a different strategy for counterinsurgency warfare. So Generals Walt and Krulak decided to try a different approach. They created and ran the Marines CAP program. Now, in 1965, Vietnamese living south of the 17th parallel were primarily coastal agrarians, with 80% of the entire population living within just 10 miles of the coast, and 70% growing rice for subsistence. And this is the small green band that I've shown here with arrows. Okay? Now, taking lessons from Mao Zedong's insurgent rise to power in an agrarian setting in China, Ho Chi Minh implemented a guerrilla-based strategy, placing heavy reliance on the populace of South Vietnam to provide both men and food for the Viet Cong and the regular North Vietnamese army. The village represented the center of gravity for the communist movement. Walt and Krulak were of the view that by protecting the villagers from the hostile incursions of the communists, there was no need for U.S. forces to venture miles from the coast to seize territory as on a conventional battlefield. The people simply didn't live there. If the people could be protected in their liberty to carry on their daily lives without fear, what real attraction was there in communist ideology? And once those people came to believe they were secure in those liberties, they would trust their protectors and willingly inform on the bad guys in their midst. The essence of the program was to separate the people from the Viet Cong by having a small contingent of Marines actually live with them in the village. Beginning at the lowest level, that of the peasant, CAP achieved noteworthy success for three reasons. Small numbers of Marines do not agitate hamlet life or create xenophobic reactions to military forces. The Marine squad had adequate firepower to convince the peasants of their military competence. And the rank, age, and attitudes of the Marines chosen for the CAP made it easy for the peasants to identify with the Marines as individuals. Unfortunately, there were almost as many battles fought between the Marine generals in Westmoreland as there were between the U.S. and the Viet Cong. Westmoreland simply would not give up his conventional war of attrition strategy and the search and destroy missions. In order to continue the CAP program, the Marines were also required to participate in search and destroy. Out of over 500,000 U.S. troops deployed to Vietnam, the entire strength of the CAP program never surpassed 2,500. And although those CAP squads were isolated, living out in the villages, per capita Marine deaths in search and destroy far exceeded those in CAP. During the 77-day siege of Khe Sanh in 1968, 354 Marines died. Well, 1968 marked the turning point in the war, particularly in American public opinion. In January 1968, the North launched the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. The way this was reported significantly changed the way Americans viewed the war. Vietnam was the first war that issued full freedom to the press, allowing the media to cover the war as they saw it. Without censorship, appalling images enabled the public to see war as they had never seen it before. The North Vietnamese planned and executed attacks throughout the South, intending to spark a popular uprising against the South Vietnamese government. Now, militarily, Tet was a complete failure. Years after the war, North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap stated that as a result of Tet, the Viet Cong were wiped out as an effective fighting force. But it was the way in which Tet was reported to the American people that caused public opinion to change. TV images of the American embassy in Saigon coming under attack led to evening news. The media widely reported that Viet Cong soldiers had invaded the U.S. Embassy building, stating that they had made it all the way to the top floor where the ambassador's office was located. In fact, they never got inside the building. 26 men did make it inside the walls of the compound, but the Marine embassy guards kept them from actually entering the building. But the media never retracted those initial reports. Many media sources were against the U.S. role in Vietnam and held a critical attitude toward the war. The images they captured affected everyone who viewed them. They had the power to leave unforgettable and lasting impressions on an entire nation. In fact, General Giap said that after seeing how the American media reported the Tet Offensive, the North realized that they could ultimately win the war, not on the battlefield, but in the living rooms of the American people. From that point on, the strategy of the North was to simply prolong the war as long as possible in order to wear down the morale and the will of the American people. The third factor that made the Vietnam War such a turning point in American history was what came to be called the counterculture of the 60s. Now, the generation that had fought and won World War II had the utmost respect and admiration for their government. Their attitude was essentially that of Stephen Decatur, who in a toast in 1816 said, "Our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong." Their children, however, the baby boomers who came of age in the late 50s, became more and more disillusioned. Post-World War II affluence allowed many of the counterculture generation to move beyond a focus on the provision of the material necessities of life that had preoccupied their Depression-era parents. President Eisenhower's initial deception over the nature of the 1960 U-2 incident resulted in the government being caught in a blatant lie at the highest level and contributed to a backdrop of growing distrust of authority among many who came of age during that period. Images of how government officials treated Black Americans seeking their civil rights further inflamed their anti-establishment passions. A new drug culture developed. Noted psychologist and author Timothy Leary advised the young to turn on, tune in, and drop out, and to think for yourself and question authority. Then there was the rise of the New Left. They differed from earlier leftist movements that had been more oriented toward labor activism and instead adopted social activism. In the U.S., the New Left is associated with college campus mass protests and radical leftist movements. The organization that really came to symbolize the core of the New Left was the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. By 1962, the SDS had emerged as the leading organization of the new campus radical groups, and soon it would be regarded as virtually synonymous with the New Left. The principal figure in the SDS was Tom Hayden, who would go on to become a California state senator and the husband of Jane Fonda. During the course of the war, the SDS became increasingly militant. Along with adherents known as the New Communist Movement, some extremist factions also emerged, such as the Weather Underground organization, also known as the Weathermen. In 1970, the group issued a declaration of a state of war against the United States government under the name Weather Underground Organization. Two of the leaders in the Weather Underground were Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn. In the words of Dorn, quote, "We've known that our job is to lead white kids into armed revolution. We never intended to spend the next 5 to 25 years of our lives in jail. Ever since SDS became revolutionary, we've been trying to show how it is possible to overcome frustration and impotence that comes from trying to reform this system. Kids know the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives. Tens of thousands have learned that protests and marches won't do it. Revolutionary violence is the only way." In October 1970, Bernadine Dorn was put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. On May 19, 1972, which was Ho Chi Minh's birthday, the Weather Underground placed a bomb in the Air Force wing of the Pentagon. These people were terrorists. Ayers and Dorn are now tenured professors at Northwestern University and are lifelong friends of Barack Obama. Well, General Giat was ultimately proven right. The images of the war brought into America's living rooms, coupled with the anti-war activism of the New Left, resulted in the United States ultimately abandoning the people of South Vietnam to the communists in the North. Saigon, the capital of the South, fell on April 30th, 1975. Saigon is now called Ho Chi Minh City. Factors converged in the 1960s to produce a perfect storm that had a tremendous impact on our country, and it left a legacy that we have yet to overcome. Thank you very much.